I'm Lynette Zang, CEO and founder of Zang Enterprises, and I am so happy today to bring on a guest contributor, and I'm hoping that she contributes a lot over time, and I'd like to introduce you to Monica Gonzalez. Would you tell us a little bit about your background, please?
Yes, of course, and thank you so much for having me, Lynette. I'm so excited to be here with you today, talking about different topics. So as Lynette mentioned, my name is Monica Gonzalez, and my background is in finance, more specifically corporate finance. But also what led me into the world of finance was actually being a child of the early '08 crash and seeing the experiences that my family went through, which was losing their home, and coming out of that experience really just kind of gave me a different perspective into what are the drivers of the world. And so that was one thing that really drove me going into finance and ultimately working into corporate finance and managing $1 million budgets. So I'm really excited to be here today.
Well, I have to ask you this, which is, why did you want to be here today? Why are you doing this?
That's a really great question, Lynette. For me, after spending so much time in the corporate world and being able to, I'm the first in my family to go to college. I'm the first to have even like a corporate job. And so being able to build wealth within the corporate world, and then also having that experience of managing those budgets, I really started to kind of think about sharing that information and sharing that knowledge with other people. And so that's really what brings me here today, is to want to share that knowledge of wealth building and wealth preservation with other people.
Why is that important to you?
It's important to me because after having had that experience, right, of financial instability, I think it really sort of changes you kind of at your core. It makes you a little bit more cautious, and it makes you think about what risk happens when the economy has those types of shifts. And it makes you want to be better prepared. And that is one thing that I've worked for the last several years, is to just have more of that preparation, especially after seeing my family going through that and not really being prepared and not understanding what it takes to be prepared.
Yes.
That was my big reason for wanting to make that shift, to help people understand why it is important to be prepared for these situations.
You're giving me chills, because that's really what the whole point is, we've been given many gifts. You've been given a huge gift, right? And we have to share that gift with everybody, and we have to help everybody.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I wanted you to bring in a topic that you wanted to talk about today. So where are we going?
Yeah, so today we're going to be going back to the 80s, Lynette.
Okay, I remember those well.
Because that was going to be my first question. What were you doing around that time?
Well, I had my daughters in '81. And so we were making the transition, and quite honestly, at that point, I was very focused on them, since I have twins, right?
That'll keep you busy.
Yes, but I remember that period of time very, very well, with the inflation that was going on. I had a 15% 5-year CD.
Wow.
Right. And the treasury bonds were also very high, think about 12%. There was a lot of inflation that was going on. We were having issues around oil. So, there were a lot of things that were going on in the 80s.
Yeah. And so how did that impact like your friends and your family? What do you remember about that?
Well, for one thing, there's an advantage to being old like I am, because you can now look back, and even though back then I was focused on different things, what was really happening during that period of time is that we were transitioning from at least a quasi-gold-backed system into a pure debt-based system. And in the 80s, it was the Gordon Gekko Wall Street, greed is good. And Dynasty and Dallas, and these big opulent with lots of greed. And what was really happening then was that they were kicking off the new system. And every
Right.
time they want to kick off a new system and not have the public question it,
Right.
the public has to feel as if they are winning
Right.
at something.
Okay.
And so there was a lot of things financially that was happening during that period of time, but it was suckering people in, very similar to what we've seen with cryptocurrencies, quite
Right.
honestly.
Right.
Right? You let them run. Now people think, oh, look at this. And they even made a whole new asset class out of it. Right? So that's about getting people used to CBDCs.
So tell me how people were not maybe recognizing that this change, or maybe at first they were not concerned.
Well, okay, we remember we're coming out of the 60s. And in the 60s, that's when the U.S. was exporting inflation to the rest of the world as they were funding the Vietnamese War.
Yes.
Okay, so that's where a lot of things were going on. And there was a run, I should say, really,
Right.
against the dollar, as foreign governments were sending in dollars and pulling the gold out of our system.
Right.
So much so, this is like this whole block of time, but so much so that Nixon actually, in many ways, was forced to close the gold window. In other words, disassociate gold from backing the currency, because by the time he did that in August of 1971,
Yes.
we had less gold in deep storage than we did prior to the confiscation in 33.
Right.
So it was critical, or they would have lost all of the gold, but they also knew what was happening, right?
Right.
So they were getting ready, and by them I mean the central bankers and the governments were getting ready to allow gold to sort of run free. So in the mid-60s, they actually legalized gold certificates again.
Okay.
Now, who knew about that?
Right.
Gold was fixed at $35 an ounce.
Right.
Right. At that point, only the guys that were writing the laws would know about that.
Right.
So a lot of them piled into it. Now, at that time, you could not convert those gold contracts into physical gold because it was still illegal to hold more than 5 ounces,
Right.
other than the way my Uncle Al did it in the pre-33 coins.
Right.
But imagine, once they untethered gold from the currency and then allowed the public to hold it again, the other thing that happened in the early 80s was they also created the spot gold contract market during that period of time.
Okay.
Okay? And so there was all of this pent-up demand from the public who could not hold gold since 33.
Right.
Right? And so they flooded into gold after, of course, all the people that understood what they were doing and, positioned
Right.
everything for them to benefit. All of a sudden, those gold contracts that they bought into at $35 an ounce
Right.
went up to actually intraday $8.25.
Wow.
Right? And that was in the early 80s.
Right.
So there was a lot that was happening, and it was like a relief. And what I mean by that is, after the massive inflation in the 70s, like 45%,
Right.
even though we didn't officially hit that 50% hyperinflation. My father was a developer, so he was building homes. I remember that period of time, and it was a little bit challenging because interest rates were super high. I mean,
Right.
I paid 12 3/4 when I bought my first home.
Wow.
Right?
I guess that makes our right now we're
Like somewhere around 6,
6%,
7%,
yeah.
somewhere in there.
that makes that look really good.
It does make it look really good, actually.
Right.
Of course, the houses were also a lot cheaper. I think we paid
true.
like $58,000 for
Yeah.
our first, and it was like 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, 1,800 square feet.
Right.
So, and I believe we did pay about $58,000 for that house at that time.
Right.
So it does kind of put things back in perspective, right? Because what would a 12 3/4% interest rate do on the average house, which is now, what is it, 600, 700,000,
Right.
something like that?
Right. Yeah, it's way up there.
Right, not 58,000
Not 58,
anymore. Although that same house is still that same house.
Exactly.
So, gosh, can you imagine what drove it to that point? What do you think drove real estate from, 17, 1800 square foot house,
Right.
from 58,000 to, my bet is that's probably a $500,000-$600,000 house today.
Yeah, I think one of the main things was the '08 crisis, right? Like at that time when the crash happened, there were so many people that were over leveraged and
Yes.
they weren't really qualified buyers at the time. And so when the crash happened, then all of these unqualified buyers they couldn't afford their homes. They couldn't
Right.
afford their homes. And so at that point, we had all this oversupply of houses that just sat empty. And what that signaled to the market, their prices dropped, right? The housing prices dropped at that point. But ultimately, because we had the oversupply, then there was less building happening. And so at this point now, we're at a shortage where we have so many different generations competing for those homes. We have the baby boomers that are staying in their homes longer. We have millennials who are finally getting to that point where they're able to start purchasing homes. And then we have the Gen Zers that are starting to come into that time as well. And so I think that there's just a lot of competition for these houses and not enough supply.
I think that really makes a whole lot of sense on a logical basis, but it's also the devaluation of the currency.
Right.
It's still the same house,
Yeah.
right? What really makes it is the manipulation or the perception management, because going back to 2008,
Right.
where the home prices dropped about, 45%,
Right.
that's when I bought, or even 50%, I bought this in 2010, but the central banks came out and targeted certain areas, real estate, stocks, particularly those two, for reflation.
Right.
Because real estate makes up 30% of the economy.
Right.
So we can't really afford to let the price of housing implode.
Right.
And the same thing happened, a very similar thing happened in 2020,
Sure.
right? They were trying to stimulate, but in your mind, what do you think stimulate actually means? I know, I'm asking you some hard questions. These are good.
I'm laughing because, when I think of stimulate, I think of, pumping more money in the system.
That's it.
It sounds good. And it's really I think for people, it's kind of going back to your early point, right? It can be a little bit like it sounds like a good thing, but people that are thinking maybe that next step, they're like, oh no, this is not a good thing. And it's kind of like what's happening now, right? Where they're cutting the rates, they're wanting to stimulate the economy. And initially that sounds great. Like stocks are rallying, people are happy because that means that, more jobs, and it means more money to be able to have that business growth, right? And so the stock market is doing great, but then there's people there, and it's almost like there's two different worlds happening right now.
Exactly.
The people in the stock market are like, things are great, everything's great, we're going to have more money. But then the people that are investing in gold are thinking, this is not good. This is going to be more inflation, and this can still hurt the economy, even though we're cutting the rates, and the way they're selling it is like, this is good for people, they're going to be able to afford more, but it can also drive inflation, which is not good.
It does drive inflation.
Right.
And that's been their answer since the beginning, right?
Absolutely.
Since 1913.
Yes. And that was one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about the 80s, because it is very similar to the things that are happening now. And as you mentioned, there were so many things that happened. That inflation period was from like 65 to 1982.
Exactly.
And as you mentioned, the big thing that is still impacting us today is really what happened in 1971, which was Nixon saying, we're not being backed by gold because we had so much demand for the dollar. And to me, it was like, we could have thought about that a little bit more thoroughly, like some other options aside from getting off the gold standard. But it was almost like that was the quick decision that was made, right? And it's been following us and it's been affecting us.
Yeah, I'm not so sure that that was such a quick decision as it was an evolutionary decision, because when they created the money, and it's really to your point, and I want to take you back to all of that, back to 1914 and again back to 33, right? So there are parallels between today, the 1970s and 80s, and then going back before that, and really what Bretton Woods did, right, which was when the US in the 40s became the world reserve currency.
Right.
And we vowed to hold the dollar's value to 35 of them to an ounce of gold.
Right.
But we reneged on that through the Korean War, through the Vietnam War. And the only reason, honestly, because we actually went to give that status back. We went to the International Monetary Fund, which was also created in the 40s, right? To give that status back. But because I remember all of this too. Then Henry Kissinger, who was the Treasury, what was he? Was he the Treasury Secretary? I think he was. And he came out, I love his quote, because he said, "It is not what's true that matters. It is what is perceived to be true that matters," which is a huge part of how central banks operate today.
Right.
But he went and created the petrodollar and created artificial demand for our US dollars.
Right.
Which has been a tremendous privilege for us here in the US. And we have a higher standard of living than really pretty much anywhere else in the world. But
Right.
we're losing that privilege now.
What are some of the parallels of what we were seeing back then and the monetary policies that we were seeing and what we're seeing now?
Well, that is a really good point, because history has a tendency, you want to say it repeats, you want to say it rhymes, but history has a tendency to happen again and again. And there are parallels between today, the 70s and 80s, and the 1913, 1914 was the very first World War, right?
Right.
World War I. Well, we had women's movement, the suffragette movement. In the 70s, early 70s, there was the women's lib movement. I mean, I was part of that, so I got pretty obnoxious for a while, to be honest with you. It's the first time I knew I had a brain, but it was really actually pretty interesting. So there always seems to be things around women's movements, which we have the Me Too movement, civil rights. We certainly have that in this country. There's wars, so there's a lot of geopolitical friction that's happening.
Right, absolutely, yeah.
And very high inflation numbers, because we're transitioning from one place to another. Typically, there will be a stock market implosion, and if it wasn't for all the money printing, we would definitely see the stock market a whole lot lower than it is now.
Absolutely.
But prior to that crisis, you also see a rush into stocks, as people are trying to protect themselves. Let's see. So we talked stock. Oh, and there's always things around energy. Is another. So there you go. There's all of those parallels between every single time we go through a restructuring of the financial system and the currency.
Absolutely. And so at that time, right, once we've reached that peak inflation, there's a lot of frustration happening with people. People are feeling like, I can't afford anything, my groceries, housing is too expensive. So what were some of the things that we did to try to get out of that? Because
well, it was stagflation, but that's the greed is good, right? So it was a lot of money printing. So again, if we go back to what happened in 1913, a 20th of an ounce, which is about half the size of my pinky fingernail, right? 20th of an ounce of gold backed $1.
Right.
When they shifted that, then that same 20th of an ounce of gold back $2.40. So they printed a whole bunch of money and put it into the economy. And you remember hearing about the Roaring '20s?
Yes, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's what happened. And then the public was like, oh, happy days are here again.
Absolutely.
Doesn't that kind of sound like the greedy 80s?
Yes.
Exactly. Doesn't that also kind of sound like what happened, over this last decade with the cryptocurrencies?
Absolutely. I mean, and with the economic stimulus, right?
Exactly.
Also in that time frame.
Yes, exactly.
What happened is Lyndon B. Johnson had, the Great Society legislation, and that meant increases to Social Security,
Yes.
Medicare, aid for education. So there was a lot of spending happening. And one of the things that Nixon tried to do to pull back on that inflation was he tried to say wages are going to be controlled, the prices, and that helped, but only for so little.
Because
For
it
very
wasn't
little,
really
right?
true.
Right.
And you know what his nickname was, right?
What was it?
Tricky Dick.
Oh,
I remember that. Oh, yeah, I remember that whole skin. I am not a crook. Oh, yes, you are. But okay.
but it seems like there was a little bit, and you might disagree, but there was a little bit of kind of a hero that came into the picture at the time, and it was interesting. The Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker, who came in.
I remember Paul
and
Volcker
made
too.
Well, actually, maybe at the time he wasn't a hero because people didn't love what he was coming in to say and coming in to do. So he had decided we really need to tame this inflation, and he said to do so we're going to have to increase those interest rates, right? After some nice, easy money policies, he said we need to engineer a recession, basically, and that was not popular. Because there was going to be, people were already struggling with inflation,
right?
But then people were going to experience even more pain by this engineered recession. So what are your thoughts on that?
It didn't really impact, it would have impacted my parents more than it impacted me. I got married in '77 and he worked at the power company. So he had a very secure job and he made a nice living at that time. So, and there are a lot of people out there that really, if they have a lot of money, this inflation right now hasn't really impacted them.
Right.
They haven't had to change their standard of living.
Yes.
Right?
They're seeing more and more the spending that's happening, and people keep saying the economy is doing so well, but it's because those upper income households are really what's driving it, but they're starting to see that pain in those lower income households. So you're absolutely right.
Yeah, they're actually even starting to see some of that pain in the higher households that are trading down, right? So instead of going to, Neiman Marcus or something like that, maybe they're going to Macy's. Right. So they're kind of trading down.
Yeah.
So we are seeing it, and it is really interesting. But yeah, when I think back to that period of time, I told you I had a 5-year CD at 15%.
Yeah.
Right. But also what was happening was gold and silver were flying, and the public really wasn't paying attention. And I remember at that time, I'd go into like an antique store or whatever, and I could buy, everybody knows my bowl of flatware that I have on my desk. But, and I remember seeing that they had it still priced at that old level.
Right.
They weren't paying attention to what was happening in both the gold and the silver markets.
Right.
But you had gold intraday go up to $8.25 an ounce, and you're talking when Nixon did that revaluation in '71, then they revalued gold from $35 to $42.22, which is still the official U.S. price of gold.
Right.
Which I think is quite interesting.
Yeah.
As well. But yeah, to your point, we have so many parallels.
Absolutely.
And the advantage that we have was that we actually can buy gold today.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that takes me to my next question, which is we talked about all the parallels in terms of the easy money policies and what the Federal Reserve did. But what about the people? What do you think what are the lessons we can learn and take away from those cycles?
Let me tell you, if I had really understood it like I understand it today, instead of buying that $20 leather purse,
right,
I would have bought another $20 coin, right?
Absolutely.
So I would have done that, right? If I had really understood at 17 and 18 what was actually happening in the economy. But, you know, people were not really prepared. They were more independent and self-sufficient than they were then. I mean, we always had a kitchen garden, and we lived in a fairly rural area, Kingston, New York, which my good friend Gerald Salente lives there. And so we were more, and the neighborhoods were a lot closer. I remember this neighbor of ours, because everybody there was on a well, right?
Wow.
They always ran out of water every single summer. And you would see hoses coming from all of the neighborhood houses across the street, even if we had to do them together, to make sure that they had water.
Wow.
Right? So it was very community building.
Right.
And that is, I'm getting chills. And that is so critically important.
Absolutely.
That back then we came together in community, and today we really have to come together in community to help each other through this.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. And you can argue that the reason why it is more fragmented today is even because of some of the policies,
100%.
the promotion of the single family home, and because before there was more families living together, right? Grandparents, intergenerational homes and things of that sort. So yeah, I feel like everything does kind of go back to the policies and the things that were pushed by our society. And when we come, there's less of that now. There's less of community, right? Because of...
but is it society, or is it the central banks and the government policy?
Right.
Right? Because what they really wanted... you brought up Social Security before.
Right.
And this is like critically important because that happened in 1933. Right? So that's when, and to your point, and we are coming full circle with the intergenerational families.
Yes.
Right? We are coming full circle.
Right.
Where everybody had a job. The little kids had their job, and then the grandparents had their job, and everybody came together. But they knew when they took us off the gold standard that would force more women into the workforce, right? And so the woman was the nucleus of the family, right? The kids came home from school, and the mother was there, and she made them a snack or whatever, and go out and play, and I don't want to see you till dinner, kind of thing. And then we had latchkey kids.
Yeah.
Right? And that does create that separation and that distance. Right? And it is the breaking down of the family unit.
Right.
Now, my mother always worked because I'm the youngest of 7, right? So they didn't have a lot of money when I was growing up, and she had to work. She worked with my father, catering and what have you. But most of the moms on the block where I lived, you know, they were stay-at-home moms.
Right.
And now, how many stay-at-home moms do you have? And I'm not passing judgment. I think every person, male, female, and of course, I've always worked, and I've been a single mom since my daughters were 3. So I really do get it at a very deep level. I just want everybody to make the choice and have the ability to make the choice.
Absolutely.
Right? That works for them.
Absolutely.
Because also 1971, the average wage that supported a family of 4 with 1 wage earner was $10,500. Yeah, I think the average wage now is like $68,000 or something like that. And I mean, and you and have had this conversation other times at the velvet handcuffs, right?
Yes.
Right? The velvet handcuffs.
Right.
So that you think that you're doing better than you're really doing because with intention.
Right.
They are inflating your value away. And you are therefore, even though it nominally looks like you're making more, you're really making less.
Right. When you
They
adjust for inflation.
Exactly.
Exactly.
I mean, they stimulated everything below 250,000 a year.
Right. And same for stocks, something to consider and keep in mind, right? Is when you're looking at stock returns, well, what does that look like adjusted for inflation, right?
You know what? That's such a good point. And not only that, but part of the perception management, which is a formal program by the government, is nominal confusion, right? Because what did they know when they created this system? Not one man in a million understands inflation, and that people marry the legal money of the state. So, the dollar can never go away. No, it can transition into a completely different being.
Right.
It is a completely different being
Right.
than it was in the beginning when it had gold backing.
Absolutely.
And I want to say something about that backing piece, because governments can come out like Zimbabwe just did, and they're saying their currency is backed with gold, but you can't convert it into it,
Right.
right? So if you as a citizen don't like what the government's doing, you have nothing,
Right.
no tool to have any power or any say or hold their toes to the fire.
Right.
A currency is not really backed by gold unless it is convertible into that gold.
Right.
And I'm not saying that you necessarily have to do it, but you have to have the right to do
option,
it.
right?
Voila.
Right. Absolutely.
Just like with families, right?
Sure.
It's that optionality that I'm fighting for.
Yeah. The choice.
Exactly.
Choice. Having the choice. Great. So we talked about community, right? That was one of the lessons that we could take away from the 80s, is building community is so important, because as you mentioned,
Critically
you had
important.
your community, and when one neighbor ran out of water, everyone else was there to come to the rescue.
Exactly.
What about financially?
Well, at that point I was pretty young and naive, but I can remember it being a struggle for my parents, because my father built houses,
Right.
and how many people really wanted to lock
Right.
in at 12.75%.
Sure.
So I know that his business dipped a little bit. But it was very hard for people. I mean, I can remember you could only get gas every other day. So depending upon whether your license plate was odd or even, or had a vowel or whatever, that determined when you could go and get your gas.
Right.
It was a very interesting period of time. I was young. I went to college, and I had $10 a week. That was my budget. That was my allowance. I lived in the dorm. And, I remember going to the bank and getting my little $10 a week. And then, maybe we could go into the city, because I
Right.
went to school at Fairleigh Dickinson in Teaneck. We could go into the city and get something or what have you. But, fiscally, it was very hard on people because of the inflation was so high. But still, I could get through a week on $10.
Right.
Could you get through a week on $10 today?
Absolutely not. No. I couldn't get to work on $10 a week.
Yeah, exactly.
But as far as preparing, what would you do differently? Thinking about those cycles and those downturns, and that part of our economy is recessions. That is part of our economy at this point, that we go into these recessions, we go into these dips. So how do we prepare for that, knowing that it's built into our system?
Well, it is built into our system, except that we're at the end of this currency's life cycle. So the difference between the 70s or the early 1900s, that was the beginning of this grand experiment. Now we're at the end, and I can say that we're at the end knowing full well that that's where we are. Is all you have to do is look on the Federal Reserve Education Department purchasing power of the consumer dollar.
Right.
Right?
Right.
They push the stock market up, up, and up, so that's what you're looking at. But if you can only convert it back into those dollars, and if those dollars buy you nothing, we've already lost officially more than 97% of the purchasing power.
Right.
This is very different because, we started, it was the Industrial Revolution in the late 1800s that pushed us into this new era where we had perpetual central banking. We transitioned from a fully backed currency to a partially backed currency to a not really backed currency, which then 1971, boom, gone.
Right.
Okay? And when I say backed, it's because up until 33, citizens could convert their dollars into gold. Up to 71, other governments could convert their dollars into gold. So it was backed because it was convertible, right? They took that out, and and there's virtually no purchasing power left in the currency. So what happened? I'm going to ask you a question that I ask everybody, and not one person can give me a good answer for it. Let's see if you can. So when the purchasing power gets to zero, we're at 3 cents now, what happens?
That's a great question. And
nobody talks about that, do they?
Well, this is the thing. I think no one talks about it, Lynette, because we don't want to think about that. I think it's too scary. It's a scary place to think about, right? And so that's why we don't have this conversation. But this is the thing. Exactly. We have to. Because the core of finance is risk management. And I think about this when I think about my family a lot, because growing up, we didn't really talk about money. That wasn't too much of a conversation that we had. We didn't grow up with a lot, so we kind of knew that we didn't have a lot, but it was not a conversation that we had very often. And so I think today these conversations about the reality of where we're at, what our currency is trending toward, I don't think anyone really wants to talk about it because it is scary.
Well, you know what I think, that more than scary, it's not encouraged. Because once you start encouraging that, now you're having conversations and questions about what is money? What am I working for?
Absolutely.
I mean, if people actually understood that what they're actually working for is debt.
Yes.
And then you take that debt and you create even more debt.
Right.
And that creates the money in the system and the inflation and everything else.
Right.
So that's why this conversation is so critically important. And your family was not unique to that. My family didn't talk about money either. But that's because it's not encouraged. We are not encouraged to question those in power. They want us to just follow blindly. Right? So what is it that we need to do? Food, water, energy, security, barterability, wealth preservation, community, and shelter. Because these are the things that we need to sustain a reasonable standard of living.
Absolutely.
But you're in my home, and so you're kind of seeing, and you'll have a tour of the grounds. And I've been working on this, really, I knew the system died in 2008. And all of that money printing that you were talking about, it's still sloshing around in the system, right? It doesn't, they create it and then it goes away. No, it pushes prices up, and people buy and sell, and it sloshes around in the system. It doesn't go away.
Absolutely.
Right? So it is, but we don't have the same luxury of time that we had since 2008. And I didn't think we'd have this long a period of time. And I can't tell you the exact moment that we're going to lose all of those choices. Right? And it'll become apparent to everybody else. But we need to generate security in all of those different food, water, energy, etc. And that's why community has become so important, and this education.
Absolutely. And I'll be honest with you. These topics are even hard for me, because when you think about the end of that currency life cycle, you remember that that's also going to mean a lot of struggle, right, for people. There's going to be hard times. But to your point, this is why we're having these conversations, so that people can start to make educated choices, so that they can understand where we're at, what's happening, and use the information to fuel their preparation as they deem fit.
Is there anything else that you want our viewers and our listeners to walk away with for this, our first of what I hope to be many, many sessions together and conversations together?
Yeah, absolutely. For me, I really like to have these conversations. And also, I'd like to think about what are some of the actions that you can take and how you can use this information to drive those actions. So that's a really big thing for me, is sharing, once again, just sharing the information so that people can make informed decisions, so that they can understand where we're at in terms of the economy and financially, and then just be more educated on the subject so that they can prepare for themselves and their family and their communities.
Yes, absolutely. I love this conversation. And you know what else I love? That you're going to be translating and having some things that are on air in Spanish too.
Yes, absolutely.
So that is probably one of the things that I'm so excited about, because everybody does need to understand this.
Yes.
And you need a foundation in sound money. That's what we do at Zang Enterprises, is we help you build that sound money foundation and portfolio. But we also have this whole network, and we will be rolling out another channel, so you'll be part of that too, I hope, on all of the rest of the mantra: food, water, energy, and security. We're still going to bring in their barterability and wealth preservation, but an action item that I would encourage everybody to do right now is get to know your neighbor. Start to build that community, because everybody has a talent, a gift, or something that they can bring into the community.
Right.
And you need that diversity to come together, because we're stronger as a whole than we are as an individual.
Absolutely.
So I'm really glad that you're here, Monica. And
So
I look forward to doing this again.
Thank you for having me, Lynette.
I love this. And to all of those out there, I hope that you got as much out of it, because I think these conversations are going to get more and more and more interesting as we go along and we build this relationship. So until next we meet, can you see? Together we can make a positive difference for a lot of people. And I task you, look in the mirror and say to yourself, if not me, who? And if not now, when? Because I know how hard it is when you think, but what can I do? I'm just one person. Said 7 billion people. Join this community. Let's build that solid foundation, not just in money, but in all of the security, in all of those areas, so that nobody can be taken advantage of. And until next we meet, thank you again. And please be safe out there. Bye-bye.